Hey everybody, welcome to today's stream. As we hinted at earlier in Discord, we're going to be doing a slightly different format of stream this time. We're going to be streaming a few sort of questions that people have had about Crayta, trying to answer those questions for you. Trying to give a little bit of a live tutorial in the editor. So we've got a few things that people have already asked about in Discord that we're going to try and cover. A few other things we've thought about, but also if you've got any questions while you're watching the stream, anything at all, uh, well, editor related preferably, just drop them straight into the chat and we'll see if we can include them in the stream as well. Generally, I think we're covering topics around cameras and lighting. Is that right, Russ? And a few things around differences between basic and advanced mode.
Yes, I think we'll cover cameras and lighting as a start, but then obviously we'll take suggestions and go through. We had a few on Discord earlier, as we say, so we'll add those in at the end and yeah, go from there.
But first, I'm going to take a present to a tree. You want to do it as well? Don't think anyone's helping us with this one, but you know, feels like something to do.
Yeah, let's go for it.
You get some points for it. So yeah, these hub events are still running. I think they're going to run for around another week and a bit. I think maybe another 2 weeks.
Yeah, you've got a little bit more time. One more course to come after this one.
I need to reach 50 points so I can get that new outfit, because that is something I would like to have. Oh no, it was a slide. Okay. As expected, we failed, but it's alright. I got some points.
Pick up my first present.
Nice. Okay, right. Let's actually get on with the creation. So, just a quick refresher for anyone who hasn't seen this before. We want to just show how you can share games with Stadia friends. So I'm going to create a new team deathmatch to do all this in. Call this something like my stream TDM. Nice. Okay, right. Let's actually get on with the creation. Russ, I think you got some sound coming through there. So I'm going to create this game. Choose an image for it. And then once I've gone into the game, I should be able to share that with any of my Stadia friends, so I'll be able to share that with Russ. I think you stopped it now. Nice.
I'm not sure what that was, to be honest.
Oh, okay. You could hear it, right? I'm not just going crazy.
I couldn't hear anything. I think you're going crazy.
Maybe I am going crazy. I heard something. Okay, so now I can go to my current game, go to the sharing tab, and change who I'm sharing it with. So let's find Russ, and then we'll say continue. So that gives Russ permanent access to my editor, so that means even if I leave the game, even if I've just left the game for a while, Russ can always come back in and go into this editor and make changes without me being here. So only give that permission to people that you trust to be in your editor, but obviously I'm going to trust Russ for now. Chris says we could hear it too.
Thank you.
I think you must have been playing YouTube in the background or something. Okie dokie. So we've got a list of things to run through.
Who knows?
I think the first thing was from Boop, which was a question about what are the differences between basic and advanced mode, because I think Boop is a big creator of ours, but he's been doing a lot of work in basic mode as far as I know. So obviously basic mode is kind of familiar to the normal controls that you'd have in a game, so you can run around as your player, you can select things from the library, you can like place the blocks in front of you, and you can change their size, and place meshes as well to add to the voxels, for example, archery target, let's get that. Place those. Oh, I realise why I crouch every time I close the library is because I changed my crouch button to B as well.
Yeah, that'll do it.
Oops. Yeah, maybe I need to change that back. Damn. It makes it so much easier to roll. Say that, I can't roll. Stand up. There we go. So those are the sort of controls that you expect in basic mode, and as Russ has just shown, you can do a few other things. You can do like a fill mode as well. You can undo and redo changes. I'll let Russ keep his grass. But obviously this is accessible for controller users as well as mouse and keyboard users, which means there's obviously a few limitations in terms of the controls that you can do. So you can always switch to advanced mode if you're a mouse and keyboard user by pressing the tab key. That will equip your drone, so every player has their drone. You can change the drone in the Customize tab of the main menu. And then once you're in the drone, this is how you access advanced mode. So most noticeable difference, first of all, is that you move completely differently. So it's still like WASD to move around, but to look around you have to hold down the right mouse button. And you can also fly up and down with Q and E. So a major difference of advanced mode is it can be a lot quicker and easier to access some hard to reach places. Although you can also fly around with the drone in basic mode by double tapping the jump button. The library is slightly differently laid out. It's essentially the same. You've got a couple more tabs, I think. You've got things like scripts, which I don't think you can access from basic mode. You also get a hierarchy of the world, which you can't see in basic mode unless you go into the properties of something and switch to the world tree view. You can also change world settings in advanced mode, which is something that you can't do in basic mode. When you select objects, you get a couple of controls that just make it a little bit quicker to manipulate them, or allow more precise manipulation of them. You can move objects and you can rotate them with the rotate tool. What else is there? There's also a few more voxel controls. So you can do quite a lot of different voxel operations in basic mode. Like we showed, you can do fill. You can also do things like extrude. I'll just show that. You can pull voxel faces out or push them in. But in advanced mode, there's a few other things you can do. Probably the most useful one is things like the shape tool. So you can make, for example, a cone by selecting the cone thing there. Let's make a little mountain, make a mountain out of pebbles. You see, we can just drag out the cone tool and then nice and easily create a cone. And that sort of thing is really tricky to do in basic mode and can take a little while. That's a nice advantage of being in advanced mode. I think that covers most of the major differences. Is there anything big I've missed, Russ?
Not that I can think of. Like I say, it's more like you get a lot more flexibility and power. So things like the world tree open up, kind of being able to do extra things like grouping entities. A lot more kind of control over how the world tree and the game comes together. But yeah, I think that you've kind of covered most things. Just seeing from chat, Slater B Burn mentioned, I don't know if you mentioned it, but when you're in the drone mode, I think it applies to the basic mode drone and the advanced drone, but holding shift will speed the drone up and holding control will slow the drone down. So you can kind of move with a bit more precision.
That is correct, and I should have mentioned that. So yeah, that's another advantage of flying around in the drone. So we've just seen a message here from Iceland saying, learned this week that pressing V disables or enables the grid. So I think he's referring to like the grid lines that you see, which helps you to do like voxel work. And if you press the V key on the keyboard, that will disable or enable that. So there are a few shortcuts which aren't too well documented at the moment. So we'll quickly run through a few helpful ones. That's obviously the first one. Another really handy one is the R key, which will move the player to directly under your cursor. So if I wanted to put the player on the mountaintop, I can just hover the cursor and press R. You'll see Russ is teleporting all over the place. I can also do that. So
yeah,
if I wanted to test if my player could balance along this, I can just instantly move them to it, then try and walk along. So that's quite a nice control.
It's kind of a nice one for if you are a basic mode player and you're at a PC. It's quite a nice one to be able to do where you can basically say if I want to get to the other side of my map, instead of having to run all the way over, I could tab into advanced mode and then just kind of put my cursor to the other side, press R, and then tab to go straight back to basic mode. And in that sort of back and forth, you can kind of quickly warp your character around and then continue in the basic mode, which works quite nicely.
Yep. Some really like common ones from a lot of editors, but possibly things that you might have missed, I'll just cover quickly, are things like cut, copy and paste. So Control X to cut, Control C to copy, Control V to paste. Those are always quite useful. And undo and redo is Control Z and Control Y. What have I done? I think I've cut something accidentally. There we go. Control Z and Control Y to undo and redo. We've also got a really handy one for screenshots, which is the I key, which turns off all the UI, or the editor UI that is. And also if you're playing in the game, you'll see there's still a little bit of UI when it's an editor preview. Up at the top right corner, you've got things like press F5 to edit. I will turn that off as well. If you're in here as well, you can press O to open the console, although that is written up in the top corner. And obviously the console is quite handy, and it's got different tabs, like a performance tab as well. That's a really useful one.
With the interface as well, if I just go back to the editor. So we'll probably touch upon this a little bit more with cameras when we get to that. But you find when you press I, you actually get like a slightly different kind of field of view almost. So I think when you're positioning a camera in game, it's always worth turning the UI off with the I key.
Yeah.
Because that's a little bit more realistic to what the camera will actually see. If Adam, I don't know if you want to just flick back and forth, like you should see how you kind of get a slightly different field of view with and without the UI. So when positioning cameras, I think that's a really key thing to make sure you've tested the camera's position with the interface off.
Yep, that's a good point. I've just shown in front of this mountain thing that I made. If I line that up exactly with the top and bottom and then press I, it actually comes in quite a lot, maybe more than you'd expect. So you lose the top and bottom of the hill. So definitely worth checking that. What else is there? Scrolling the mouse wheel for brush size. So if I'm placing a voxel block here, I can scroll up and down to change the size. And in advanced mode, you can go quite a lot bigger with the voxels than you can in basic mode. So I think, yeah, we can go to a 25 by 25. Another nice thing you can do in advanced mode actually is you can change different dimensions of the brush. So for example, if I wanted a really tall stick, I can do that as well, which is quite nice. You remember a time when we didn't have the undo?
Yeah, I remember when in the early days when we didn't have it, and you just had to be really careful because you couldn't undo. That was fun.
A couple of other things. Showed this earlier that I could switch quickly between the move and rotate tools. So the move tool is default when you select something. Move gizmo, sorry. But you can switch to rotate with F2 and back to move with F1. That's quite handy. Another really useful tool, if you select something far away, you can press the F key to focus it. So whatever position your camera might be in, you'll stay at the same rotation, but you'll snap to have the object in the center of your view. Especially helpful if it's out of view. So say I'd lost this archery target, I'd hidden it below my world somewhere, but I could see it's there in the world tree. Maybe it's affecting my game in some way. I can find it in the world tree and press F to work out where it's gone. There we go. I'll bring it back up. Another one that I just thought of actually. These things are snapping on the grid. As we're in advanced mode, we can turn off grid snap so that they move smoothly, which is better for precise positioning. But if you don't want to always tick grid snap or untick grid snap, you can hold the shift key as you move and then they'll move smoothly. And vice versa, if you've got it unticked by default but you hold shift, then it will snap to the grid. That's all the ones I can think of. Can you think of any more?
The only other one I can think of was F2. F2 does a rename.
Oh yeah.
So if you're in advanced mode, and you select something in the world tree, you can right click and rename, or if you press F2 with it selected in the world tree, you'll automatically get the rename, which is really important. Again, like we've said in the past about keeping the world tree kind of clean and tidy and, a nice hierarchy. And part of that comes with kind of sensible naming. Once you've placed your sort of 40th archery target, it might be nice to start, naming them all in relevant things, to kind of help distinguish which one is which later on down the line. So yeah, just a nice quick quite quick tip there. Just F2 will rename the entity if you've got it selected in the world tree.
Yep. And that goes with the top tip of mine of all time, which is please keep the world tree tidy. Please always group things and name them properly, because if that starts to get messy, it can be a nightmare to work on your game. Another small one, which most people have probably noticed, but if you're editing properties on here, so for example, if I'm editing the position, you can press tab to go through the different property windows. What am I editing here? Oh, I'm editing the game controller. I want to edit the archery target. So I can go like minus 200, 600, 100. You can tab through different things to like change the numbers really quickly, so that's quite a handy one as well. I think that's everything now. I know I've said that like 3 times, but I think that is all the keys I
think
can
we
think
really are. Yeah, there may be more that we've forgotten, but I think they're definitely amongst like the most common ones that you'll likely not have heard of or have been using from the start.
Echo Rock just said it might be worth showing the key binding area and a few shortcuts that aren't assigned to advanced mode by default. So I think you mean the controls part. So is there stuff that's not assigned to advanced mode by default? Editor. I think these are all assigned by default. I have the brush size. Oh, the brush size increase and decrease. Oh yeah, so if you do want to change any of the controls, for example, the editor controls, like scrolling up and down to increase or decrease the brush size, you could always add keys for them, or you could even add controller buttons for them as well. That could be quite handy. And I'm going to change my crouch back now, or it trips me up anymore, because I put
Constantly
crouch on
crouching.
B. So extra action 2 needs to go back to B, and then my player crouch go back to the right stick. Okie dokie. Cool, so I think that was a question from Mochi about the keyboard shortcuts in the editor. I think we've covered everything there, but obviously we will aim to get more of those documented as time goes on as well, so that everyone is aware of them. Put that down. So the next sort of major topic we want to cover is cameras. So this was asked about by Slater Beburn, and a few others I think chipped in as well. So we want to just give a general overview on how to use cameras, what the different types of cameras are, different properties on cameras, things like that. Kind of with an eye to using them for cutscenes as well, if you wanted to do that. Although I don't think we'll specifically try and make a cutscene right here on this stream because we've got a few other topics to cover as well. So first thing I want to look at with cameras is actually on the player, because by default, obviously the player has a camera as part of them. It's part of the player template, and that is a useful thing to know because sometimes you can say like entity get camera, and in that case, it can sometimes return a player if your user's current camera is just the player, i.e. if you're just controlling the player, then user get camera will just return you the player entity. It will only return you a separate camera entity if you have assigned the user to go to a separate camera entity. So, got a few options.
Yeah, I think that's quite a big distinction to make, isn't it? There, like it won't always be a camera primitive. Like a player character can basically act like a camera primitive.
Yep, that is correct. So we've got a few options on the player for the camera. So some useful ones are obviously the camera type is very important. So at the moment we've got action camera. So if we just preview that, the action camera is essentially like a fairly close third person. It's worth knowing that people in your games can press the page up or page down keys to change the camera type. I think that's the options button on controller. It is, that cycles camera type. So you can by default go into first person, third person, and a further out third person. That was nice, wasn't it? The way I killed you on the last one.
Yeah.
You can stop players in your game from being able to do those. So you can choose an option in forced camera perspective. So you can say first person only or third person only if you want to do that. Another important one is camera collision enabled. So if I just adjust this bush in the world a bit, we should be able to see the difference. So I currently do have camera collision enabled, which means when I'm in my third person view, if I run up to this bush and sort of move the camera against it, you'll see it pushes the camera in, so the camera moves towards the player, which can kind of push you into a first person view if you're right up against an obstacle. However, if I go in here and disable the camera collision, play the game again, that then allows my camera to freely go straight through obstacles. So you do get this sort of clipping effect as you go through things, but in some games it's okay to be able to see like behind where the player is, particularly if I go in a further out camera. It's fine that I've gone behind this obstacle here, and that really might suit your particular game. If, say, it's a side-scrolling game and you've got lots of obstacles or something in front of the player, you don't want the camera like clipping right in close as you walk past those obstacles. So this might be a better option. On that note, let's have a look at the other camera type we've got available. So that was the action camera. We've also got orbit camera. So this by default allows you to freely move the camera around the player. And the way they move doesn't change the direction of the camera. You can move it separately using the right stick or the mouse if you're on mouse and keyboard. And then you actually move the player with the left stick or WASD.
Yeah, it's worth noting that straight away, so going into an orbit camera on any of the sort of stock template, the sort of starter games that are like weapon based, so things like Team Deathmatch, like we're in, as soon as you swap to that orbit camera, it sort of breaks the way the gun works because you've got the crosshair still, but obviously the players aren't quite looking in the right direction, and sort of it doesn't know how to behave with the guns then, so that's something to be aware of.
Yeah, that's right. So just watch out for that if you are changing the camera type. But there are ways to make it work, but it might require a little bit of coding. So that's the default orbit camera type, and with camera collision enabled turned off, if I sort of push the right stick down, then I could get the camera to go into the ground. So I'm going to turn that back on. Camera distance is a really useful one. So if I set that to something extreme, we'll instantly see the difference there. Because I'm now miles away from my player, well, 2,000 centimeters away. Remember, all units in Crayta are in centimeters, so 2,000 centimeters or 20 meters away from the player there. Then what else have we got? We've got the camera pitch and camera yaw. They don't mean too much if you've allowed the camera to move around. So if you haven't ticked camera angle lock, that essentially dictates where the camera is going to start. So you saw that the camera was starting like parallel to the ground, looking straight on sideways at the player. I could change that so that we're actually looking down at the player when we start. But the other thing I can do is tick camera angle lock. So this will stop you from being able to change the angle of the camera with the right stick, or the mouse even, if you're on mouse and keyboard. And this is a really good way of making more interesting game types. So if you want to make something like an isometric kind of top-down game, which is pretty much what I've made here, then that's a good way of doing it. And you can also use this and one or two different tricks to make a sort of side-scrolling game as well. Let's bring the camera a bit closer in, maybe 300. And if I leave it locked now, then you'll see that the player kind of runs across the screen, and I can't change that. Now they can run sort of into the screen and out of the screen in a sort of forwards and backwards way. But there's different things we can do to change that. You can either call a function on the user, which is setMoveOverride, and you can pass a 2D vector to that. If you want them to only go left and right and not forwards or backwards, you have to pass a new 2D vector of 1, 0, I believe.
We could have a quick try at some point.
Yeah.
We'll see.
I don't want to go too in depth into that because it's not really camera
No.
related, but there is that way of making a side-scrolling game. Feel free to ask us in Discord if you are trying to make a side-scrolling game and you want to know that trick. The other possibly simpler trick that I'm going to very quickly show is I can actually make basically invisible walls so that the player physically can't move. Where are my invisible walls? So I think I start at that blue thing, so I could literally just make some walls. Turn their visibility off. And then if I play, I've ended up at the other spawn, haven't I?
I think so. Just slide your wall across. Or make another wall on that side, so we've got one on both.
I'll slide the wall
just in
across.
case.
Oh no, I forgot to copy and paste. Right, yeah. Where's the blue spawn gone? Okay, so I think what's happened here is a symptom of having the camera collision enabled ticked, because actually there's nothing to see there, but there is still collision on it, so the camera's pulled right in. So what I can do to fix that is go back to the player template and untick camera collision enabled. Now the walls aren't going to collide with my camera. And there we go. So I haven't made the walls quite close enough, but you'll see I pretty much have a side-scrolling game now. And in an orbit camera, as Russ was saying, it changes how the gun works. But when you're in orbit camera, it basically shoots in the direction your player is pointing, I believe. I might be wrong.
Yeah, I think it's like the player's facing direction, not where they're looking. It's just where they're facing. So you kind of end up, I think, with like the 8 degrees or whatever, the 8 different kind of up, down, left, right with the diagonals as kind of the directions you can actually shoot in, even though the player doesn't look that way. That's kind of where the bullets will go. But obviously, you'd need to do some changes to that kind of the crosshair and stuff to just kind of to kind of properly relay that to a player.
If you don't mind, Russ, I'm going to get rid of our invisible walls.
Yeah, absolutely.
What have you been building here?
Just a little thing. I figured if we're going to do some in-world camera stuff, it'd be nice to have a thing to focus on.
I've just seen a comment in the chat about making this game available on mobile. So that is, as Iceland has said, that's part of the magic of Stadia. So you can play this game on mobile, and it's basically exactly the same experience as playing it on a big screen or a laptop or a TV or whatever. It just transfers instantly, and I think you can go straight from playing on, say, your computer straight onto your phone and carry on the same session. Is that right? Pretty sure.
Yeah, I do that quite often. Like I'll be on the kind of at my desk working, and then I might go in the front room and sit on the Chromecast on my telly for a bit, and then once I'm ready to go to bed, I'll just like swap to my phone, and I've not like exited the game at any point. So yeah, it's really nice. It's like mobile games and more.
So one thing I'm going to do now is just pull in a package that I made earlier, which is called input something, input handler, that's the one. And this is a simple package which basically just has events for all the different button presses you can do, every button press and button release. So I'm going to attach that to the user, and then we're going to use that to attach ourselves to a camera. So Russ, if you want to make a camera in the world that points at the fountain, maybe?
Okay. I'll show you my working in a moment.
So this has a whole list of events, which as you can see, just say like primary press, primary release, secondary press, secondary release, and I can just create events on there, which call functions in the world or on the user template. So you've put a camera here.
Yeah, so to do that, all I did was dragged a camera primitive from the library, and then if you want to select that camera
Mm-hmm.
and just show, you've got two buttons on the right hand side, which are really kind of quite useful buttons that are specific to a camera primitive. The first one, move drone here. I always have to think about this before I click them.
Yeah.
Move drone here will move your drone to the camera. So that's a nice way that if you've got several cameras throughout the world, you can click that to kind of snap to exactly what those cameras are looking at. Or move to drone will put the camera exactly at the position and rotation of your drone at that moment. So as I was saying earlier, I can basically move my drone. I think, Adam, you can see me over here.
Yep, I see you, Russ, so go for
So
it.
I could move my drone to here. I can press the I key to hide the interface, just so I can get an exact idea of what the camera is going to see. And then put the UI back, and I can click move to drone. And then you should see that camera primitive is now snapped
Oh, I'm inside
to
your
where
drone.
my drone. Oh, yeah, you've moved.
Yep.
There we go. So that's a really handy way. You can manually do it. You can kind of set either through the properties or through the rotate and move gizmos, but having that option through the drone, it just makes it so much faster.
Yeah, absolutely. Something I'm going to quickly do now, Russ, if you want to help me write a very short script. I'm
Sure.
going to add a script and just make it. Oh no, let's do this on the user actually, so we can have a few different cameras. Do you want to go to the user template with me? I'll make a new script folder called cameras, and a script on it called, let's say, camera switcher.
Yep.
Can you make an entity array property in here of the different cameras, and I'll make a function to switch between them.
Okay. So all I'm doing here, for anyone who's not aware of the scripting, so I mean, first thing to point out is probably, we are collaboratively coding this at the same time, which is pretty cool. Allows us to do things really quick. And what I'm doing here is essentially setting up a property that will appear in the right-hand side of the editor. So people making scripts can expose certain things for people to use in their games, which is, it's a really nice touch, and it helps people kind of learn and kind of makes the scripts a lot more flexible.
So what we can do on the user entity is call set camera, that function. And there's two ways we can call that function. We can just call that with a camera entity passed in. So in this case, we should have an array of cameras, excuse me, on self.properties.cameras self.cam index. That's just a number I'm using to keep track of the camera index we're on. So we can say set camera and just pass in a camera entity, or we can also pass a camera entity with a transition time, which is just another number. So first of all, let's just do it like that. So we just have switching straight to the camera entity, and then we can show it with the number next. So if you want to put that camera in, Russ, and I'll make a second camera.
Okay,
Assign that
so
as well.
we should see now I've saved on the right hand side. We've got our cameras array, which means we should be able to set up multiple cameras.
There we go. So there's a camera 2 if you want to drag that in. Where are we?
Camera 2. Oh, and do you want camera 1 as well?
Yes, please. Oh, we've had. Oh, you do it. I'll just watch.
Okay, they're backwards, but never mind.
Okay.
That's the part of the fun.
So first one should be camera 2, confusingly, which is this one here. So we should get this view, but remember, you can check the actual view by pressing I to hide the editor UI. Then we should get this view. Now we're not actually calling the function to change camera at the moment, so this is where the input handler comes in handy. Should we say do it on the extra action one, which is the
Yeah,
Y button on
sure.
controller, or the R key on keyboard by default? So I can just add a new event into there, say that's going to call something on cameras. It's found the camera switcher script, and we'll say next camera. Okay.
Yeah, when it comes to picking like extra actions, it's always good to consider kind of what extra action one means in a controller sense and a keyboard sense.
Yeah.
Things like when you want to reload a gun, you might want to think, which button makes sense most on a keyboard and a controller, that sort of thing. And bear in mind that certain players will probably or could have rebound what extra action one means for them. But if you kind of work from the defaults, at least,
Yep.
that'd be good.
Remember, you can just go to the settings tab of the main menu, go to the controls tab of that to see what the default control bindings are. In here, if you've got the default setup, that is. You can always reset to defaults up here as well. Okay, should we give that a go? I'm hoping it works.
I think let's go for it. Yeah.
So we can run around. Oh, we've got stupid cameras still. Hang on.
Nope. Not stupid, just different.
Stupid for this game. I can't even look around.
Just go back to action cam,
Action
I guess.
camera. Okay. If I press the Y button now, yay, it works. You'll see we can cycle between the different cameras with that quick script we wrote. Although when it respawns our player, this is worth bearing in mind, when a player is respawned, the camera will switch back to them. So there we go.
Cool.
Right, should we add some transitions?
Nice and easy. Yeah, I'll set up a little property for that. It's
Okay.
a nice habit.
I'm going to paste in a third camera just for fun. Say, move to drone. There, so we've got 3 cameras now. Go back to our user so we can have a look at their camera stuff. We'll add camera 3 into here. Action camera is the best camera. Most of the time. Depends on the game type, I guess.
Personally, I quite like the orbit camera. I think that's one of my favourite ones. Yeah, so you got a property there, transition time, which is a number, and a current default of 2. I feel like 2 seconds is pretty good.
Okay, so I've just added self.properties.transition time into there. So yeah, you've set a default value on that, but of course we can see that in our property editor and we can change that value if we want. Let's say 1.5 just to be awkward. So now if we try playing the game and we want to go to our camera, you'll see we actually get a really nice smooth transition between each camera, which takes exactly 1.5 seconds. Okay. So this is really nice for making quite simple cutscenes and things. You can just have like a script with a schedule on it or something that's got some timers that just goes through different cameras and maybe make some other things happen in the world as well. Now one other thing I want to show is let's create a function just to go back to our player, because as we said the player entity itself is actually a camera as well. And if you do something like a cutscene, you're going to want to go back to the player. Let me zoom in a bit here. Don't need the library opened up. So we might want a function to say like return to player, because otherwise it's going to be quite hard to shoot Russ. So all we have to do here is say self get entity set camera, and in this case we want to get this entity's player. As we know, this is a user entity, so saying get player on a user will get them their player, assuming it is actually alive. And let's use our transition time there as well. One thing it's always worth doing in code is having checks for anything that might be nil. So in this case, self get entity get player could be nil if the player has died and been removed from the game, or if you never spawned a player or something like that. So what I'm actually going to do, need to allow copy pasting. So I'm going to say local, so new local variable player equals self get entity get player, and then only if player will we do this. So if player means if the player is not nil, then we'll do the camera transition. We can just pass in player here. Otherwise, if the player didn't exist, then that's fine. We don't do anything. We don't go back to them. And let's quickly hook that up into another entity, another input event, sorry. On the input handler, we can go extra 2 pressed. That's going to change us back to the player. I'm going to wait for the round to start, because otherwise it's going to try and change me back early.
Commence the shootout.
Yep. Okay, so pressing extra action 1 or the Y button will cycle me through the cameras. Extra action 2 or the B button will transition me back to my player and give me back control. It's also worth mentioning actually that even when you're in another camera, if you still have an active player on your user, then you still have control of them. Trying to get them over that fence. There. So if I press Y, then I do actually have control of the player still, and that control is relative to where the camera is. So if I push left, then I'll move to the left of the camera. If I push right, I'll move right. Push up on the joystick is going to move me sort of forwards into the screen, and pulling down will move me back towards the camera. I don't seem to be able to escape now. Oh, there we go.
No. So there's some interesting sort of like gameplay mechanics there as well. Like it's not just necessarily a cutscene thing, but you know, maybe there's some challenging puzzle type thing you could do with that. It's also worth noting, again, I just noticed that if you shoot, that was still shooting from the camera and hitting the crosshair. So I was shooting the statue while I was panning around it. So obviously the way the gun script works is it kind of takes from the camera's position, which is why it doesn't work with the orbit camera, but it does work better with the action camera. So you know, there's potential there for little CCTV turret shooting things. You know, there's the stuff you can do with that. It's quite cool.
Yeah, definitely. That would be quite a cool application of it actually. I think Cubics Defenders does some really nice like shooting from a turret rather than shooting from the player. It's a cool game. You should go check it out. So, have we got anything else to look at in the camera? We have, and it's an important one for several reasons. And this is the field of view. So, FOV stands for field of view. By default in Crayta, it's always 90 degrees for everything and everyone, including on the player entity. And the field of view is essentially the angle in which the player camera can see. So at 90 degrees, that means they can basically see in a right angle straight out from them. If we changed it to say 45 degrees, it would go like that. So they can only see a very narrow field. So that's going to look like everything's zoomed in. And if we go to 110 degrees, it's going to go much wider. So you can see more stuff to your sides, but it feels like you kind of zoomed out. Should we just give that a go? There's 2 options here, third person and first person FOV. If I change to something like 150, which is a pretty crazy one, then when we spawn in, you'll see we have this kind of cool, super zoomed out looking view. So, like the camera's position relative to the player is actually the same here, but the reason it looks so zoomed out is because we've got that wide field of view, so we can see so much more of the world in here. Of course, if we change to one of our cameras, we'll change to that field of view. So we come back to this normal 90-degree field of view now. Then if we go back to our player, we come right out to that. So you can do some really cool effects transitioning between different fields of view.
Yeah, it's quite nice.
It's
also worth noting that that's how the default gun script works with its, when you hold secondary to aim down the sights of the gun, that's essentially a field of view change to make it appear like you're doing sort of a closer lean down and zoom in.
It certainly is. So you'll see on the gun properties, you've got this iron sight item scripts that can be attached to anything that you want to be able to do iron sights on, so kind of zoom in with. So basically guns, you want to like zoom in a little bit to focus. So that changes the field of view. By default it's 60, so you can see that you zoom in a little bit when you do iron sights, which is the secondary button. I'm going to change that to 25, which is going to zoom us right in. The other useful part here is the look speed multiplier. So when you do your iron sights, this changes how fast you can look around. If I change that to 0.25, so a quarter of the normal look speed, and then play, you'll see I get to a weapon that feels a lot closer to like a scoped weapon. It's not actually scoping. We don't have like the UI come up on the screen to look like a scope or anything. But you'll see now that when I press the left trigger, the secondary button, I zoom right in, and I've got a slower move speed, although it still feels quite fast. But that's just because I've got a tight field of view now, so small movements feel a lot bigger. Oh, I pressed Y to reload and forgot that's our button to go to the cameras as well.
Nice.
So that's a really nice effect that you can do. I'm going to go to our user and make it the third action button change to those cameras, just so we don't accidentally do it.
Cool. So there's only one more thing I can think that I wanted to mention with regards to cameras, and it's something I learned while doing Canyon Miners as a nice little trick. But if you're in the orbit camera, so as Adam said before, you've got that problem where you can get the camera to move into an entity, and then the camera pushes against the player. The option that Adam showed before was like kind of a worldwide thing that would have meant that the camera would pass through everything. So if you turned off camera collision, you basically then the camera can go through the floor, it can go through like it can almost spin around anywhere on the player. But if you want to kind of control that on a per entity basis, then actually what you can do, let me just extract this hedge here, because this is probably a nice example. So let's say we don't want the camera to be affected by this hedge when we're in an orbit cam. If you just want to set us up in orbit cam, Adam, as well, so it's got
Sure, yeah.
so it's not fixed, but has collision still. And then when
not
you're
fixed,
done,
but has collision. So orbit. That's actually better being like -30 or something. And we don't want the camera angle locked anymore, so it's a normal orbit camera.
it is, yes, yeah. So I just realised this is only going to work with meshes. Sorry, not with
Okay.
voxel meshes. So let me pick a big mesh.
Yeah, while you pick a big mesh, there was one other property I missed on the player that I should have mentioned. When we're in orbit camera, there's this secondary action property here, which by default is do nothing, but you can choose a couple of other options. So secondary action being like the left trigger on a controller or the right mouse button. That can snap the camera to the character, so it'll pull the camera around to face the same way as the character's facing, or snap the character to the camera. Which might be kind of nice, except for the fact that we've also got a gun with iron sights that uses secondary action, so I'll leave that for now. But those could be quite useful and unique mechanics for your game. Okay,
Cool.
Russ.
Yeah, so we've got this big space wall that I've placed down. So let's say we've got an orbit camera game. We want the camera to collide with the terrain because you don't want the players to be able to peek through walls, but you don't want this particular piece of the environment, this mesh here, to actually be affected by the camera. So if you select that, Adam, you'll see that you've got your collision preset options.
Yep, I see that.
So in that, if you pick collide with player only,
Okay.
then what that means is when we hit play, so I'll hit play now, is basically the camera's gonna not have any collision with that specific mesh.
So it collides.
So
it doesn't collide here either.
So you should see that if you shouldn't be able to collide through the floor. Oh, you can.
I think that's my fault.
Just double check that.
Camera collisions back on. Okay, that didn't happen. Go.
Okay, cool. Cool. So that's a check. So we shouldn't be able to collide through the floor. So that's given us, yeah, that's what we want. So we don't want the camera or the player to be able to kind of clip the camera through into areas they shouldn't be able to, perhaps like a secret door or something. But let's say we've got parts of the map or the terrain that we don't really care about. So, for example, in Canyon Miners, a lot of the fences and a lot of the things that would always be in the way, basically between the player and the camera, if it constantly clips on all of those, the camera will be jumping back and forth. So by selecting the collision preset to be the player only, you can see that here I am actually able to get this camera to go through that, and then it creates less of a problem. especially as I say when you've got lots of things in a line, perhaps, and that sort of thing. So just a nice little tip if you're using orbit cams to think about on a kind of per entity basis controlling that collision rather than just turning it off for the entire world.
Mm-hmm. If you are using this sort of mechanic in your game, where you can have your player go behind walls and things, for any like pro coders out there, something you could consider doing is giving like a little grey sprite or something on your player when they're behind something. So you could do a raycast from the camera to the player. If that raycast hits something in between, then you know that there's something obstructing the player from being in view of the camera. So you could like turn on a sprite so you can indicate where the player position is, if that was something that you wanted to do.
I think that would be good. Right, I think we've covered everything we need to. We could talk about cameras for days, but I think that's hopefully given a good oversight of some of the controls.
Not quite. There was one more thing I wanted to show. What is the third extra action button? The left on the D-pad. Just because I changed the field of view on a couple of external cameras as well. Similar stuff, but those 3 cameras we put around the fountain. Oh, it's the up on the D-pad. So I gave that one a massively wide field of view of about 150 degrees. Next one's regular 90. The next one's a really tight like 40 or something. You'll see that has some really cool effects as we go around. Okay, that was all I wanted to do.
Oh, that's quite cool. Yeah, combined with the transition, it gives it like an extra level of like zoom and stuff. It's pretty cool.
If you were feeling keen, you could always make a script that changes the player's field of view on the client. So you could do like a field of view pulse or something. Maybe if a player took like massive damage, they could do something like that. Speaking of taking damage, as this is a team deathmatch, I do want to do one thing quickly. Because we had noticed some frame rate drops and we've tracked down what's causing it, and we will update the widget, the offending widget, but just in case you're seeing frame rate drops when you take damage in your game, you can open up the crosshair widget. If you scroll down a bit, you will find this damage stuff. This damage CSS class here, it's got a filter blur. That, as it happens, is actually really expensive, so if we take that off, we don't get those frame rate drops anymore.
So that was what? That was line 133, I think.
Yeah, I think so.
Delete that. Yeah.
Cool. And the only visual difference is the little like red arcs around the side of the screen when you take damage won't look so faded. They'll have sharper lines, but you can avoid the frame rate drops in that way. Okay. So then there was lighting.
Yeah. I think at this point it might be worth mentioning we had one of the suggestions we had earlier from Discord was about the spectate script. But we've had to drop to basically just me and Adam on the stream tonight. So spectating is going to be pretty tricky with just the 2 of us. So we might save that for another time. But if you do enjoy this sort of format of live tutorial, then do let us know. And obviously we can look to do these more often. I think they're quite good for us. You know, we quite enjoy being able to share any knowledge we've got. And it helps us kind of learn what the community needs. So yeah, do let us know. But yeah, that might be one thing we save for next week.
Yeah, I was going to plow straight onto that after lighting, so thanks for reminding me.
Yeah.
But there's a couple of things we did have a look at the spectate script between us, just because we weren't all that familiar with it. There's a couple of things we noticed that you could do. We noticed it has this section here. So this is when it has to choose if it can spectate a user, and it will return false if you can't spectate that user. So here it says if the user entity does not have a team property. So that makes sense for most shooter games and stuff. You'll be on teams, but if you want to be able to spectate people and it's not a team game and there's no team property on the users, for example, you might have a battle royale where you've just got rid of the team properties entirely. You can just take that out entirely, and then you'll be able to spectate even if the user entities don't have a team property. And the other part of this if statement is if the user entity's team property is not the same as your team property. So if they're on a different team to you, it will return false, so you can't spectate them. You might want to be able to spectate people on the other team. In fact, in this, since it's just me and Russ, we do want to be able to spectate each other potentially, so I'm actually going to cut that section out.
Yeah.
And that just means that regardless of whatever team they might be on, we'll still be able to spectate them. So spectating may now work a little bit, but that's just something to be aware of that's quite handy.
But yeah, we'll probably do a bit more work on it ourselves, and we'll have a look at it, and we'll maybe pull out some useful things. So I think one thing that was mentioned was about showing who killed you, for example, stuff like that. So there might be a little bit of tweaking to do, but we don't think it'll be too much. But as I say, I think we'll probably save that for a stream where we can get maybe 3 or 4 of us in, and the spectating is a lot easier to demonstrate.
Yep. One thing I'm going to do, Russ, is create a locator under your fountain thing, so I can just tidy that up so we can start putting some lighting into the world tree.
Yeah, sorry.
If you want to drag any fountain parts under that thing called fountain, that would be useful.
Yeah, will do.
I'll get all the fences in, but if you see anything,
Okay.
I'll maybe put the 3 cameras in. Okay, that just helps tidy it up a little bit. So yeah, it's nice and easy from advanced mode to keep the world tree tidy. A little bit trickier to do in basic mode, so even if you do prefer generally creating in basic mode on the controller, if you're able to use advanced mode, it might be a good idea just to sometimes tidy up your world tree a little bit. So, on to lighting. There's a few different sides to lighting. The first thing you can do is just general game settings or world settings, sorry, for your lighting. So if you go to the world settings tab, really obvious one is time of day. So you can drag this, but you have to be quite precise with it, or you can double click to change the numbers. So changing the time of day obviously creates a massive difference in lighting. Find that about 5:30 is really nice to have the sun low in the sky. And obviously you can change the sun's direction as well to have it cast shadows in different directions and appear differently in the sky.
It's probably worth mentioning as well at this point that all of those changes that Adam made, I can see in real time. So, for example, if I start changing the direction of the sun and maybe, sort of moving what time the sun's at, like, you should be able to see those happen in real time. So, from a collaboration point of view, it's really nice to kind of artistically work out the certain settings for the game in a way that you can all in real time see it. You're not having to wait for the game to build or light maps and all that sort of stuff to compile. It's literally like it's instant.
Yep. Another nice thing you can do here is just change the day length. So this is 0 by default, which means you have no like time of day effects. But if I change that to 10 seconds, for example, we'll instantly see in the editor that every day lasts for 10 seconds. So we can see the sun go over in the sky, set again really fast. I don't think we see that many games make use of what do you call it, like changing time of day.
Day-night cycle.
Day-night cycle, that's the one.
Yeah, maybe that's what Canyon Miners is missing. Maybe that needs a day-night cycle. Well, in fact, no, that does do. So yeah, some people you'll see. Yeah, it does actually, but it's based on UTC time, which is why I always see it in a day because I only play it during the day. But yeah, that's right. So that uses the UTC time to set the time of day to the actual time of day based on sort of the server's location. But yeah, that's quite a nice touch. So the adventure template and the adventure starter game comes with a script that does that. So if you're interested in that, just fire yourselves up a adventure starter game and have a look at the time of day scripts in there for some real time of day stuff.
That is there. Okay. It's just worth mentioning with these 2 tabs actually. The reason there's 2 is game settings. You might think it looks pretty much the same. It's got a couple of other things up here, but it's got this whole rendering settings and death plane stuff, which the world settings has. The game settings is basically the overall settings for the whole game. So you can have multiple worlds within a game, which are like entirely new areas that you can build in. They're entirely separate from each other, and players can go between different worlds. For example, they have different levels in a game or something. If you set game settings, so let's say, for example, undo that. let's say the game settings say that your start time has to be 5:30. Every new world you create by default will have a start time of 5:30. So this is kind of like a template for your world settings. And that's the same for everything down here. We changed, say, the horizons are already set, I think, in this world. But if we change something like the skylight overriding, you'll see that can actually apply in here as well. But for now, we're only working in one world, so we'll just look at the world settings. So there's a bunch of other things you can do around the sky. You can do sky dome assets, you can do different horizons and stuff. If you want, you can override the sun, so you can change its intensity, make it really bright or actually quite dim. And you can change the sun color. So you'll see it's casting quite a white light across here at the moment, but we can just change that so the sun is red, and that looks really cool. Actually, I feel like keeping it like that. What do you think, Russ?
That's
Like
pretty
that.
cool. I mean, maybe go for like a slightly creepier vibe. But yeah, you can see straight away that that's made it's not just changed the actual color of the sky, but it's changed the light that it's kind of putting down into the scene. So the grass was very much more red because of that. So it's not just an aesthetic thing for players looking up at the horizon, but also you can really start to hone in the look and feel of the game. So you might have seen the stream that we did with a couple of the artists from the studio, and they did a lot of in this area around really making that space settlement that we made, really kind of honing in and making that kind of look and feel like an alien planet essentially.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, the sun is obviously a pretty major light source. If you don't want any light from the sun at all, you can always go to midnight, and then you can do your own lighting. So if you wanted your own like sun, you can just create a light, or have a deeper look at light entities in a minute. If you wanted a fake sun, you can always just make a directional light, points down in the angle of the sun. So you'll see there that doesn't look as realistic as the sun, because we've just stuck in one light and there's no like ambient lighting or anything, so it looks very strong and quite harsh. But that's how you can make like your own versions of a sun, or that could be a moonlight or something. So back to the world settings. Let's revert that to our 5:30. So I mentioned there was no skylight, there was no ambient light. You saw just there. So even though the sun is coming from that direction at the moment, I can still see the back of this like onyx base, and I can still see the grass behind it even though it's in shadow. And that's because of skylight. So that's kind of like an ambient light that's across the whole world, which is there during the daytime, fades out as you get towards the nighttime. So if I override the skylight, I can actually change the settings on this. So I can make the skylight really, really bright, and that just basically makes everywhere bright. So now you can see the sun hardly has any effect, hardly casting shadows, because we've boosted the ambient light everywhere. If I turn that back down, we take it out completely, then I can only see things that are in the light of the sun, and any areas in shadow, as you can see there, are completely black. I can't see a thing there.
That looks really cool.
It does look cool, but I want to be able to see. I'll turn it down.
Yeah, no, that's cool. That's really nice.
So yeah, something quite nice to do actually is override the skylight in your game, because it can be a little bit bright by default for some moods. If you override it and turn it down, that can often give you a lot more contrast and make your game feel a lot more impactful visually. And you can obviously change the color of that as well. So if I boost it back up, and have the sort of ambient color be really purple, any color you want.
You get really, really wacky with it.
Yep. Let's turn that back down to something quite low for now. Cool. One other option that I missed is obviously the sun is casting shadows there. If for any reason you don't want the sun to cast shadows, you can always just turn that off. There's actually some games where you make a really, really big complex world. Sun shadows can have quite an impact on performance. So if you don't really need them, you can always turn them off to just save a few extra frames per second. But generally don't worry about that unless you get to some really big complex worlds.
Yeah, I mean, or even from a gameplay point of view, like you might find you say, if we turn the sun shadows off, we get kind of a bit more of the ground back. So if you like the way this looks with like the silhouette of the statue and the trees and stuff, but you kind of want players to be able to explore behind this statue, then it makes sense to turn the shadows off if you kind of want that space back, because obviously with the shadows on, it's a very dark area behind the statue, and players might get lost in that space, or there might be a collectible they can't see and that sort of thing. So it's kind of worth experimenting with them with that.
Yeah, definitely. So I guess let's have a look at actually playing with some light entities now. So, oh no, wait, there's a couple more options, and then we'll get to the light entities. So these aren't really lighting; they're just general aesthetics, but they certainly have an effect on lighting. So color grading is a really important one. So there's lots of different preset options for color grading, but I think we've got red accent, so that will basically make it black and white except for pulling out all the reds. If I make the sun a bit less red,
I'm gonna say I feel like
then you'll see that just pulls out the reds and leaves everything else black and white, which is really nice. Russ, you got some red on your outfit. So that's quite a cool one. Or you can do things, you can do really crazy ones like super color, which like really brings out all the colors, makes them really powerful. Can look cool for like quite outlandish or wacky games, or games set on maybe an alien planet. There is also one called Alien Planet, which gives you more like blues and purples. A lot you can do with that, and you can actually
it's
combine.
also worth.
Sorry, go on.
So I was going to say it's perhaps also worth just you were saying about uses. Then, like, you can set these sorts of things on a per client basis as well. So
Yeah,
you might want to use some of these things not just as a aesthetic for the game, but it might be that the players are injured, or they've something's happened to the player, and it's quite a nice way of drastically changing the scene, and therefore portraying that that something's happened. It's quite a good little trick.
yeah. I think quite a few games change to monochrome when a player dies, don't they?
Yeah, that's quite a good idea. It feels like Red Dead Redemption, and I think Rockstar, that's kind of a thing that they do
Yeah.
quite often.
So there's something you can do with the color grading, and then post-process. So this is actually changing how the world gets rendered. So we've got some quite crazy options that we can choose in here. Sketch is pretty cool. What we've got outline, that's quite cool.
I'm still waiting for someone to make a game
Yeah,
completely in outline. I feel like
cell
it's
shaded
crying out for it.
is a little bit harder to see because we made our world so dark, but it kind of makes everything look like it's comic book style. It's all got like drawn outlines around it, which is really nice. Let's put our sun override back on. So yeah, you can combine color grading and post processes to make really cool effects. 8-bit is quite a strong one, but we have seen a couple of interesting games that use
Yeah,
this.
yeah.
Cool. Now let's have a bit of a dive into the light entities. So that was just overall world settings. Obviously, you can change lighting in any specific place by adding light entities. So should we put some on the fountain first?
Yeah, yeah. I think that might be good.
Do you want to do a couple of lights and I'll do a couple of lights and see what we've both done in a couple of minutes?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'm happy to talk through the different types as well if you want.
Yeah, go
Give
for
you
it.
a little break. Yeah, so there are a couple of different types of light that we have on option. So we've got a point light, a spotlight, a directional light, or a rectangle light. So point lights are kind of your defaults. That's what you'll get, and that's essentially how you would kind of imagine a light to work normally, kind of in the world. So you place it, and then that will cast light from the light itself as a source in like a bit of in an orb, essentially in a circle all the way around it. You've got spotlight, which I think that's what Adam's currently playing with, which is almost like a torch or something. So that will come out in a cone, and that will have a couple of its own settings. So things like the inner and outer circle, which we'll play with in a moment, and that's how you can control kind of how sharp the torch is. So, for example, for a flashlight, you might have a spotlight attached to the end of a flashlight mesh, and then therefore wherever the flashlight mesh is kind of angled, you've got this cone of light coming out the end. You've also got a directional light. So Adam he mentioned earlier, we've got the a directional light which can act like the sun.
Wow.
So there's one thing to take into account with the directional light, is that it doesn't actually matter where in the scene a directional light is placed. The only thing that matters is its rotation. So you could have it under the world, on top of the world, inside of something. It wouldn't matter. The light would come from everywhere in that specific direction. So if you find you're playing with a directional light and you're moving it around and nothing's happening, it's because the position of a directional light doesn't actually matter. And then a rectangle light, it's not one I play with too much, but I think it's kind of does what it says. It's kind of like a spotlight, but instead of being the cone, it's kind of more of it's a rectangle. So it's a nice way to fill an area, perhaps with light across a floor or something, maybe. Or if you've got like an underglow of something, you'd do that with a rectangle light. Obviously, a point light would be spherical. A spotlight is a cone, and this is basically a rectangle version of those.
The nice thing you can do with a rectangular light is it kind of, whereas a point light literally comes from a single point and spreads outwards, a rectangle light, a spotlight comes from a single point and spreads out along the cone, whereas a rectangular light can come, it comes out of the rectangle that you've defined. So you can get quite like strong edges against it. So if you come around the back of the statue, Russ, you'll see where I've put one. You get quite like a hard edge against where the rectangle starts. Change
the
size of the rectangle, so I can make it change that one. I can make it like cover there. In fact, this is quite cool because I can put this in the middle of the statue, and then it sort of comes, it's like wrapping all around the statue.
Yeah, that's cool, but on a very hard line, as you say.
Yeah.
It's not like it's bleeding out in the direction you don't want it to.
Yeah. Then I could flip it over and make it a different color to give some nice contrast there. I mean, I say nice, not exactly artistic. There we go. So you can create some quite unique effects with that, the rectangular light. Yeah, I don't know what we're trying to make, but it looks cool.
It looks cool. Yeah, I guess it might be worth going through some of the properties of the various lights.
So can I use your light 4 that you've put in front here?
It can do, yeah.
So this light, what's this? A regular point light by the look of it?
Just a standard point light, yeah.
You're doing something with a disco
There's a
light.
script on it. I was just going to get ahead of it so we can show off how you can change some things in code. But yeah, if you talk through the properties, then we can look through the script and see how that's affecting them.
That sounds good. So obviously we've got all the normal properties. Visible is very useful for lights, being able to turn them on and off. And then we've got the type, as Russ has discussed. We've got the color. Let's make this a bit more interesting. Go for a green. Intensity is kind of exactly what you'd expect. You increase that number, the light becomes more intense. You decrease that number, the light becomes less intense. Exponent is a little bit of a tricky one. It's essentially how sharply the light falls off. So it might be easier to explain with the number 1 or the number 2 here. So you can see there, if I go for a lower number like 1, the light is quite intense near the middle and stays quite intense as it goes out. Whereas if I go for a big number like 8, the light falls off much more sharply. So what happens there is basically the intensity of the light is calculated by the intensity multiplied by the distance to the power of the exponent. I think it's the inverse of the distance even. So essentially, if your exponent is 1, then your fall off is linear. If your exponent is 2, then your light fall off is squared, quadratic, that's the word. So it basically, if you could see a graph of the light intensity as you get further away from the light, it would start up here and sort of go down in a curve in a quadratic with a quadratic exponent, so with 2. And as you increase that, basically it becomes a sharper and sharper curve. I think the default is 8 because that's realistic. I think that's how light actually naturally like falls away from a light source. But if you want to light a big area much more easily, you can turn that right down to the minimum, which is 0.001. You'll see at the edge there's so little fall off that it's actually still quite bright right at the edge, so we get this hard line around the light. Then we've got specular, so that is essentially whether or not surfaces will reflect this light source. So you'll see there as I move it back and forth along this onyx wall, you can like see the onyx wall sparkling with little like light green sparkles. If I turn off specular, we lose those light green sparkles, so we're still lighting up the onyx, but we've lost that reflection. It might be easier to show you with a metal.
I was going to say, yeah, this is one that I think if you've got like a particularly flat, shiny surface, so metal counters, anything that is a reflective surface, will kind of look quite bright near a light. But if you wanted to dull that reflection, then yeah, I think you'd be better off. If you were to disable specular, you'd have less of a.
There
So
we go.
here, I think Adam's just flicked it. Yeah, you can see like basically you get that really big bright orb on it. You might not want that, and that's the specular property coming from the light.
Yep. So there, you can just untick that if you want the light to not be reflected. So you're using it to light a scene, but you don't want it to look like it's an actual point of light. Obviously, you want that on for most normal lights. So if it's a ceiling light, things would naturally reflect a ceiling light, but there's certainly cases where you'd want to turn that off. I think specular is slightly more expensive graphically as well. So if you're really looking to squeeze out as much performance as you can, you might want to watch out for turning specular off. Attenuation. So if I zoom out a bit, you can see this big like ball around the light. That gizmo essentially shows where the edge of this light is, and that's determined by the attenuation, which is essentially the radius of this light. If I change that to 500, obviously it becomes much smaller. And that has a slightly different effect depending on the light you choose. So for a spotlight, in fact I don't need to change that one, I've got a spotlight up here. So for that spotlight, you see attenuation changes the length of the cone. So if I go for 200, it's a short cone, 1000, it's a longer cone. Go back to 500. And finally, we've got shadows. So that's fairly obvious what that'll do. That determines whether or not the light casts shadows. If I put my player there. Come here, player. There. So obviously, with my player blocking the light, get really strong shadows. Whoa, you just move your player as well.
I did, yeah.
Nice. Now it's worth noting that shadow casting lights are a lot more expensive than regular lights, so you can generally use quite a lot of lights in your scene, maybe 30, 40, 50, depending on how big their attenuation is. But shadow casting lights you really want to watch out for, and you certainly can't use as many. I'd probably say keep it below 5 if you can, but it sort of depends on a lot of things like how big their attenuation is. You can always check what sort of lights you've got in your scene by going to the performance window, go to the world tab. Let me just lift up a little bit. And if you look at the types of entities in your world, you see a lot of information here, but you can see that there's 4 lights and 2 are casting shadows. So if your performance is really struggling and you look in here and it says that there's like 20 lights casting shadows, that's a big indicator of why. The other thing to be aware of with lights is that having lots and lots of them overlapping, so check if lights are overlapping by multi-selecting, so hold control and click the other lights. If their sort of gizmos are overlapping, that means the lights overlap, and for every bit of space where lights are overlapping, the computer has to calculate more different types of lighting, so it can get really expensive to have lots of lights overlapping. So I
I've
think
just
Rust is
placed 2
making
more.
us
Yeah.
you.
If you select like 4, 6, and like light 4, light
Yeah.
6, and light 7, you'll see that they're all kind of sat on top of each other now, and those spheres are all interlaced, and because they're all casting in shadow, or I think they are.
Did we turn off shadows? Oh no, they've
No,
all
I
got
think they're
shadows
doing
on.
shadows.
So
Yeah,
that
but
should
you'll see the shadows on the wall now of me dancing are getting really like, obviously from the multiple angles, it's starting to get a lot more complex.
So I don't know if you can tell now, it's not awful, but the frame rate has certainly slowed down. If we just play the game and go into that area, it certainly struggles to deal with all those lights. And if I have a look at my performance window, check my summary, you'll see it's flicking around a bit, but I'm not getting 60 frames a second. When I look towards that light, I'm getting more like 45. And then when I actually go into the light and it's trying to cast shadows around me, that drops down to 30. I did go for quite an extreme case. I've added like 30 or so lights here, all casting shadows. But that's the sort of thing to watch out for. You can easily identify it by going world, types, and you'll see there's 31 lights casting shadows. And we don't want that. So we'll get rid of the first one of those. But look at that. See just how many are overlapping there. If you imagine this point somewhere in here is probably trying to work out the lighting on every pixel for about 20 or 30 different light sources. Okay. What have you done, Russ?
What have I done? Well, so all of those things obviously you can configure and you can set those in the property, which is nice. But as games are a sort of living, breathing thing, there's a good chance the lights are going to want to change over time, perhaps. So all of those things, or at least most of them, are accessible from the through the API. So what all I've done is, if you want to, well, if I simulate, let's see if it's actually worked. Okay.
It changes the intensity.
Yeah. Is it not changing the color? Let's see.
Couldn't see the color changing. Oh, I think color possibly
Is
when
it
you
0 to
pass in color, it's
1?
0 to 1.
Right, that makes sense. That always catches me out. That would make sense as to why it was always white then as well.
Remember in Lua, math.random takes whole numbers. So what you might have to do is say math.random, just empty brackets, and that gets you a random number between 0 and 1. Oh yeah, that's what we need, isn't it?
Yeah, that's what we need.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
If you pass in two parameters, two numbers as the parameters, then it will choose a whole number between them. Whereas if you just call math.random, that just gets you a random number that can be a point number between 0 and 1. If you wanted a point number between 0 and 10, so if you wanted it to give you like 5.2, 2.6, then you can do that times 10. Okay.
Cool. Yep, let's save that script. So if we go back now and simulate, you should see most sped up a bit. So we've got a light that's flicking around, and you can see that the color is changing against the back. So it's going purple, green, blue, orange, so on and so forth. So all that's doing in that script is a little while loop, and it's looping through, and it's changing the intensity between a random min and max, which are just two properties I've made. So again, just using those properties, we could package this up for someone to use, and they've got the properties there available in the editor. But essentially, we're setting the intensity to a random number between 1 and 50, just like we're setting it to 10 manually in the properties. But this way, through code, we can change it. And we can also access the color, and we can set that up to be a new color type. And again, just a random red, green, and blue value, and that sets it to a random color. So obviously, how much red, how much green, how much blue, randomly selected, will pick a kind of random color. So a purple, a green, a red, a blue, whatever. To access the light itself from code, you're essentially accessing the entity. So remember that just because this is a light, that doesn't mean it's not an entity. So we've got it in the world tree. It's called light 4. So with this script attached to it, I'm basically saying self get entity. So I'm getting the light entity that I'm attached to. And then dot allows me to kind of access the properties. So in this case, the intensity and the color. We could mess with other things here. So obviously we could change the position and the rotation of the light. We could change basically some of the other stuff as well. So that's just a quick little tip. But lights don't have to be set as they are in the editor. You can kind of through Lua start to mess around with lights and do some cool stuff there.
How proud are you of this package, Russ? Do you think it's worth publishing? I mean, it's not a package.
Sure,
How proud
why not?
are you of the script? I feel like we could publish it as a
Script.
package.
We could publish it maybe at the end. We'll
Oh
throw
yeah,
that out at the end. A little
we'll
disco
publish it at
light
the end.
script.
Okay.
Um,
I think we covered everything to do with lighting there.
I think so. We'd made a note to go through in sort of gameplay terms, but I feel like that's quite a broad subject. So perhaps that's something that we could save for a whole masterclass, perhaps. But I guess it's worth just saying that lighting's obviously important and it's key. So when you're designing your game, you need to think about how the lighting works. And if you've got a game, for example, which is guiding players down a certain path, then lighting's a really nice way to do that. So players can know where they're going, they can follow lighting, or collectibles in a game. Collectibles having their own little light attached to them. Nice way of just kind of highlighting them to players. So there's a lot of considerations to take into account when it comes to designing and making games. So yeah, but hopefully there's plenty of tools there that we've shown and flexibility there to do some cool stuff.
Yep. Oh, I've lost it. I was going to say something else about lights, but never mind. Gone. Oh yeah, we did have that stream where we looked at the space colony, space settlement thing that we'd made, and we had a couple of members of the art team have a look over it as well, and they gave us a lot more artistic advice on lighting. So we've showed like the technical side, we've showed all the properties and how to adjust a light through a script. But if maybe Russ or Chris can drop the link into chat for that previous stream as well. If you wanted to have a
Yeah.
look at specifically how you should do lighting in terms of making an interesting scene or like how to light a specific area, that was actual artists talking about it, not just me and Russ. So that's a lot more useful for that.
Yep. I think I've got the link here.
Cool.
Let's go for that.
Okay, I think
Cool.
we had one more thing on the list, which was having a look at changing the UI in your games to make your games look more unique. But I don't know if we're maybe running out of time. We might want to push that to the next one. What do you think?
I think what we could probably do, as I say, it would be nice to maybe have Sean or someone with a lot more UI expertise. But I think for now, maybe we could just quickly cover uploading an image for anyone who's here who may
Yep.
not have seen how to sort of go through the flow of uploading an image. Because this is, again, when you're kind of creating a game, especially if you start with a starter game, it's a really nice way to quickly make a game feel like your own. So if you've got your own custom UI assets, it's again, it kind of very quickly makes it your own product.
Yep.
So if you want to get ready for that, I can get ready to
Sure.
to let that game through, because you've got a package, I think, haven't you, that will be useful for this sort of thing.
For
I think your simple image perhaps is a
the
quick
simple
one to
image
show.
package. Yes, that's correct. Do you want me to?
Yeah.
Sorry, do you want to pull in the package and I'll show how to upload an image?
Yeah,
Cool.
that sounds
Do
good.
it. Okay, so to upload an image, you can just go to our companion site, which is create.crayta.com. You need to sign into that, obviously. And then if you go to your games tab, your games there, and you can go to images. So there's several tabs up here, so it's worth being aware what these tabs are. We've got temporary image storage, and that's for things like cover images. This, it's worth noting, has a maximum of 6 images, but that is literally just temporary storage. So there's only 6 that can stay in your temporary storage. As soon as you set an image as a game card from there, or a supporting image on a game, kind of saved, and then you can remove it out of the temporary storage if you want. So to set a game card, you can go back to your create page, choose a game like my stream TDM, go to cover image, and then you can select one of the ones out of your temporary storage. I don't think I'll select any of those because they don't really apply to this game. You can also give supporting images for it as well. You can choose a few of those. Those will be shown when someone clicks on your game to see the details of it. So it'll say the description of your game, and then it can cycle through a few images next to it as well on the play page. But what we're going to look at the moment is adding your own images into your game. So I've got a whole bunch of images, but if I want to upload a new UI image, just drag one on. So let's say I want to add this beef image, if that will work. Image has uploaded successfully. Okay. So I've now got this beef image right here, which is just a little sprite that I made earlier. And that is pending
Okay, do you want to
approval.
approve? Oh,
So
yeah. Do you want Fresh. See if someone's magically got to that in the time that since you've uploaded it.
Has someone magically got to it? So yeah, generally we'll try and make sure the images are approved within 24 hours of going up. In this case, I think Russ has approved it anyway. What I was going to do, Russ, is just choose the identical image right below it. Sorry, I mean someone's approved
Oh,
it
I see.
very fast. Yeah, I did have a plan, but
No, yeah,
so what I can do is just copy the URL to that. All images can be referenced via a URL in game. So then, Russ, if you've got a simple image ready for us, so this is just from the simple image package. Oh.
There's an apple sat on the statue.
Okay, so by default that shows an apple, just because that's what I put is the link into the widget. We've got this simple image script and we can change the URL in there. So let's delete that and paste in my new image. You won't see that change straight away because what it's actually showing here is what's in the widget, and we've got a different thing in the widget. So I could always change what's written into here, but I don't really need to do that. That's just like a preview. I can see what's actually there by pressing simulate, and you'll see that loads up the actual image that I've uploaded. And simulating is what will happen in the game. So when we play the game, we can now see what an amazing team deathmatch this is. We can now see the beef.
We've got like our disco ham statue, so there we go.
There's quite something.
Cool. Okay. Yeah, well, I think, as I say, that's a nice little kind of reminder just for anyone who's making the game and wants to get their own assets in. Like, it is really quite a straightforward process. And then, as I say, once it's been approved, that's then ready with that URL to throw into a game. So hopefully next time we can get sort of someone with a bit more UI knowledge to sort of talk us through some kind of useful stuff around making UI.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I think we're kind of running out of time for today, so that's probably a good place to wrap this one up then.
It almost is. I just thought of two other very, very quick things about lighting while you were talking. There's always more to it, always more. It's just worth knowing some voxels are emissive. That means they actually have their own light source as part of them. Not their own light source as such, but they have light. So if I draw some neon on there, even if there was no other light in this world, that still has its own light, so you can see it in complete darkness. So games like Hyper Light Runner, I think it's called, make really interesting use of emissive voxels. I don't think it's got any lighting at all in that game. It's all lit through emissive voxels. The other thing is
really cool.
With lighting work, it's quite useful to be able to see the little entity icons in the world. You can select one and change the lights, but sometimes they can get a bit much if you've got a small light like on top of a candle or in a wall sconce or something. It can get a bit much. So you can easily turn those off by going to settings, editor, and turning off show entity icons. Then you see they've all disappeared, but I can still find them through the world tree. That was the two things I wanted to get to quickly. But yeah, you're right, that is a good place to wrap up, I think. Hopefully everyone's found this quite a useful stream covering basic and advanced mode, keyboard shortcuts in the editor, cameras and lighting, and a very brief bit on the spectate script as well. So yeah, let us know what you thought in the chat, or let us know in Discord if you've got any other questions, and we will probably see you next Tuesday.
Yep. See you later.
Cheers. Bye.